Listen, you're going to face some opposition. Not everyone's going to like you. And this is so important because you can't live a life focused on pleasing people and also pleasing God. It doesn't work that way. It's why the Bible talks about living in the fear of the Lord. This isn't about, when it says fear of the Lord, it's not that there's this angry, upset Father in the sky who's like looking to come down on you every single mistake, every time you slip up, like he's impossible to please. It's not that at all. But when it's talking about fear of God, it's in there saying, hey, listen, it's that willingness, it's that heart to sit there and say, I'm more concerned with the audience of one than the audience of the many. That I'm more concerned with at the end of my day, hearing from my Father, well done, good and faithful servant, than the attaboys of everyone else around me. I'm more concerned with living the life he's called me to than just living for the applause of everybody else. In fact, Paul speaks about this. Galatians 1:10 says, am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God, or am I trying to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ. There's going to be some animosity. There's going to be some pushback when you start stepping out in faith, when you start stepping out in this life in Christ and allowing his freedom to reign in your life. And listen, again, this is tough for us. I get it. If you're a people pleaser, it can be a real struggle, this whole ideal. But you do have to understand that, again, if you really want to allow freedom to reign, you want to live the life that God's called you to live, you're going to have to face it some. You're going to have to face some tension. You're going to face some pushback. And again, tough if you're a people pleaser. I like what verse 16 says. It says, then Abimelech said to Isaac, move away from us. You have become too powerful for us. So back to the story here. There's opposition to Isaac, opposition, animosity towards his growth. And yet, I kind of like what they say, and I even like even more Isaac's response. But it says, move away from us. You become too powerful for us. By the way, I love their honesty in this. They don't try to pretend that, hey, we just had some things change at work, really need you to find another location. No, it wasn't anything like that. They just said, look, we're bitter because you're getting better. We're bitter because you're growing. We're bitter because God's doing something in your life, right? And then verse 17 says, so Isaac moved away from there and encamped in the valley of Gerar where he settled. Listen, I share that because I think there's somebody who needs to hear this tonight, is that never beg someone to stay in your life. Never beg someone to stay in your life. When they asked Isaac to leave, Isaac didn't argue. Isaac wasn't like, oh, guys, wait, hold on. I'll tone it down. I won't be as much of a Jesus freak. I'll turn the K-Love down on my radio. I won't do this. I won't do that. Just please don't leave. He didn't do any of that. No, Isaac was like, he threw two fingers up. He's like, peace, I'm out. Went on his way. See, never beg someone to stay in your life. Never beg someone to stay in your life. And that's kind of what we see. In fact, it's why in 1 John 2:19 actually puts it this way. It says, they went out from us, but they did not really belong to us. For if they belonged to us, they would have remained with us. But their going showed that none of them belonged to us. In other words, truth be told, they didn't leave you. They were never with you. They didn't leave you. They were never with you. You didn't lose something. You never had it to begin with. You were never mine to begin with. Because if you were with me, you would have continued with me. And unless I show you, when someone shows you who they are, man, rather than complaining about it, rather than getting frustrated about it, rather than just living in the animosity yourself and getting stuck there, man, some of us, we need to give thanks. Hey, man, thank you for just showing me who you really are. And start going on your way and going on the mission and the purpose that God's called you to go. See, some of us, if we're really honest, we chase people because we're convinced we can't be blessed without them. As some of us, we run after relationships that are unhealthy and unholy because you don't think that you can get anybody else. No, when God is with you, you and I, we can throw this tent up anywhere and be blessed. Doesn't matter what job you have. Doesn't matter what your home situation is. Doesn't matter, where you're at logistically or the people around you. Listen, if God is with you, if you're living your life within the boundaries of His Word, I'm telling you, there's nothing anyone else can do that can stop God's blessing in your life. And listen, for some of us, again, we need to quit looking to our source of blessing in people other than God, in situations and circumstances other than God. And so it continues on. Genesis 26, 19 through 20 says, all the people in the synagogue, they were furious. They kind of, as they're going, actually, I skipped a whole step there. Yeah, they didn't throw him on the synagogue right on that one. But but going back to sort of this animosity thing, and again, talking about just never begging someone to stay in your life. That verse I was actually referring to, or was about to refer to, was in Luke 4. So, so often we think that, again, if we live this life, we're called to live, we're pursuing God, that we're not going to face opposition, that people aren't going to push back on us, people aren't going to try to leave us. But think about this. Even Jesus himself faced a lot of opposition. Especially with this message of freedom, this message of hope, this message of new life. And in fact, in Luke 4, it talks about this. He shares this message in Luke 4, talking about how I've come to bring this message of hope for the oppressed. He opens up the scroll and talks about, I'm here to bring freedom to the broken and to the hurting. And again, you'd expect people to cheer him on. You'd expect people to kind of rally around him, expect people to stick with him. But again, that verse 28 that I was going to read was, listen to how they respond to Jesus in that. It says, all the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up, they drove him out of the town, and they took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built in order to throw him off the cliff. Again, you can expect a little bit of animosity and opposition when you're pursuing the call and the purpose and the push of God in your life. I'm not saying that you go looking for it. I'm not saying that you necessarily love it. You're cheering it on. But again, you got to understand that God, He set us free, but He didn't just set us free for ourselves. He set us free for that which is bigger than ourselves. He set us free to also be a part of carrying on this message in Luke 4, that we're meant to not just set ourselves free and live just for ourselves, our own selfish ambitions, our own selfish desires, but we're meant to go out and be freedom fighters. We're supposed to be going out there with this message of the gospel and seeing others find freedom. And yet, listen, where does that take place? It doesn't take place in friendly territory. It doesn't take place around people that are always going to agree with you and always going to throw a welcoming party for you and always love you and hug you. Listen, we're called to be freedom fighters in enemy ground. We're called to take enemy ground, which means there's going to be some opposition. There's going to be some pushback. So the first thing, again, we see in there, we see the poison of animosity. But here's the other way that the enemy loves to kind of get us off of our game and to really kind of steal and try to separate us from the source of our blessing, that relationship with God, is the pull to argument. The pull to argument. See, animosity are those hidden attacks you feel. Animosity is the stuff done at night. It's the stuff done in the dark. It's sort of the passive-aggressive comments. It's a thing on Facebook, kind of like, hey, don't you hate that person that steals your sandwich? And, they're like in cubicle 6 right next to the kitchen, and they have blonde hair, blue eyes. Not naming any names, just saying for a friend. It's that passive-aggressive approach. That's animosity kind of comes about. Animosity reveals itself through bitterness. It reveals itself through this passive-aggressive attacks. But argument, on the other side, argument's very visible. Our arguments when people come directly to you to kind of stir it up with you. And that's exactly what we see in Isaac's story. In verse 20, we see them now, Isaac's left, he's gone his own way, he's doing his own thing. Well, the people, it says they chase after him. And they start to chase after him. And again, they start to create this sense of an argument. They start to share all their issues, share all their frustrations, and so much so that Isaac just gets to a place where he actually calls the well argument. He calls the well argument. He's called it a sec, which literally means argument, because they disputed with him. And listen, I share this because just as there's times where, listen, you should never have to beg if someone leaves your life. You should also be somewhat discerning and watchful if people only show up in your life when things are going great. When the bank account is full, when you got the new car, when you got the new job, when they're only there, and they only show up when life is great. You have to watch out when people only show up in your life when you have something to offer. And listen, I share this because it's important for you and I to never connect yourself to people who don't have their own wells. Never connect yourself to people who don't have their own wells. In fact, just to help a few single people out, when you're trying to decide who God has called you to covenant with and to connect your life with, you need to make sure they have a well of their own. They have a relationship with Jesus of their own. That they have that connection to the source of living water on their own. And listen, this is so important, especially for the longevity of relationships as well, but just life in general. I think of my wife. I'm so blessed to be married to a woman who's got a well of her own. Because I love to tell you that walking out this faith, walking out this relationship with Jesus, stepping in to the new things and new seasons He's called me to, that I'm always gung-ho and I'm always excited and I'm always, the tank is always full. But the truth is, is that there's times, and this may surprise you, is that I'm not necessarily all that thrilled to show up to preach at church on a night. I know it might shock you, being a pastor, right? But my wife, when my well gets empty, when my tank gets empty, my wife is the first one there to sit there and out of the overflow of her well, sit there and say, no, God's got a call on your life. God's got a mission that He's called you to. He's got a situation. He's called you a purpose, a ministry that He's leading you to. You need to get out of bed, right? You need to get there, and you need to do what you've been called to do. I'm so thankful for that. And listen, if you hope to make it through this life with, especially against opposition, and especially against the attacks of others, the attacks of enemy, you gotta make sure that you've got some people around your life and in your life that they've got their own wells too. That they're not just showing up only when your well's overflowing. But again, back to this whole idea of argument, is that, and anybody that's sort of a natural arguer, like you tend to, like you were a part of the debate team, you like to argue, you like to duke it out, right? I'll be honest, I'm kind of one of those people. I like that kind of stuff. My wife doesn't, though. And so I know I frustrate my wife tons because I'm a natural arguer. I'll start to argue about just about anything. Even when I'm wrong, I'm still trying to argue and win the arguments, all right? And the problem is, and if you're a natural arguer, or if you find yourself around some people that argue a lot, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but you ever argued so much and you start getting into it and you're making your case that you forgot what started the whole conversation to begin with? Like, that happens to me all the time. I'll start this argument, people get frustrated, and we're wondering, how did this start to begin with? But that's the point. That's why the enemy throws those rocks of argument in our way and in our path. It's meant to distract us from God's purpose and God's call and what God wants to do in and through your life. In fact, when you think about it, most arguments that we have, they're really pretty pointless arguments. Like most of the things we stress about, we worry about, we stay up late at night, where we post all these rants on Facebook, they're pretty dumb. They're pretty insignificant. They don't matter. In fact, if you doubt that, all you got to do is look at Facebook. In fact, actually, I saw this as some of the top arguments on Facebook in the past year. And here's where some of them: pirates versus ninjas. That was one of the top kind of arguments you find on Facebook. Or dogs versus cats, which I don't really think is an argument at all. I mean, obviously, dog over a cat, right? Or how about this? Creamy versus chunky peanut butter. You know, I think that's worth getting a little worked up about, right? I mean, you shouldn't be chunks in your peanut butter. Or blank versus the world. This could be anything. Minnesota versus the world. You versus the world, right? Most of the arguments that we get so worked up about, most of the things that we get so frustrated about, if we're honest, they really are so small and they're so pointless, and we should have never began to get so worked up about them in the first place. But listen, the enemy knows that. That's why he loves to throw out the pool to argument, because arguments are designed to distract us from your ultimate purpose, to distract you from what you were actually created to do, where you were created to go. See, the enemy knows if you can be pulled into an argument, you can be pulled away from your assignments. And you'll stop doing what you're called to do because you're more worried about what you've got to say than what you've got to do. And again, it's tough. If you're prone to the pull of arguments, this can be a tough wrestling match. And in fact, Timothy, he was a young preacher at the time. He was kind of prone to this. And in fact, in Paul, in 2 Timothy 2, verses 23 through 26, we see him giving some advice to this young preacher and talking about not getting caught up in some of the, just foolish arguments, petty arguments, to not be staying up all night to 3 a.m, getting into it on Facebook. Look at what he tells Timothy. He says, it don't have anything to do with foolish and stupid arguments, because you know they produce quarrels. And the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but must be kind to everyone, able to teach, not resentful. Opponents must be gently instructed in the hope that God will grant them repentance, leading them to a knowledge of the truth, and that they will come to their senses and escape from the trap of the devil, who has taken them captive to do his will. See, you got to understand something. Why the enemy loves to throw out this pool to argument is because the enemy doesn't want your water. The enemy wants you to stop digging. The enemy's not worried about what you have. The enemy is worried about what you might get. That if you keep doing what God has called you to do, there's going to be some people in your life that are set free with the message of the gospel. If you keep living out this purpose that listen, you are a freedom fighter, that God has placed people in your life to reach out, to love on, to share the gospel with, to be a light in a darkened world. There's going to be some people that find deliverance, that find their way out of the devil's trap, right? But listen, the enemy, again, he's not out. He loves to throw the pool of the argument, though, again, to try to distract us from God's call and God's purpose of our life. And again, it's a purpose much bigger than just living for ourselves. So real quickly though, so how do we deal with this though? I mean, how do we actually turn our enemies to frenemies? Real quick. The first thing we discover, and I love how Isaac was able to kind of turn the story. I mean, here he had all these enemies, all these people opposing him, trying to throw the poison of animosity, trying to throw out the pool of argument, and yet Isaac, each and every time, would just keep going his way, keep going the way that God called him to go. He wouldn't get sidetracked or distracted from God's call and God's purpose and the freedom that God had called Isaac to live in and live out in his life. Well, the first thing you got to understand is that if you hope to turn your enemies to frenemies, is you got to learn to dig below the surface. You got to learn to dig below the surface. Verse 21 says, then they dug another well, but they quarreled over that one also. So they named it Sitnah. Now Sitnah actually comes from the Hebrew word Satan. Satan. It's Satan. It's, in other words, what he's getting at here, what we see in the verse is that you gotta sometimes when you're in the heat of the moment, you're in the heat of the argument, you're in the heat of the dispute, is you gotta remember there's more to the story. You gotta dig below the surface. Sometimes it's more than just a person that's got a little bit of an issue here with you. There's an enemy that's trying to steal your future. There's an enemy trying to steal what God wants to do in and through your life. In fact, Ephesians 6:12 puts it this way. It says, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against authorities, against the powers of this dark world, this unseen world, spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. You got to dig below the surface. Because I think for some of us, if we would actually take the time to dig below the surface of some of those things we get so worked out about, you would see that there's more to the story. You'd see that there's an enemy that's oftentimes trying to work against you to try to pull you back in to less than the life of freedom that you were called to live in. But not just that, it's also learning to look below the surface of that person as well. You know, it's been said that hurt people, right? And that's so true. See, so what we're talking about is empathy. You've got to have a lens of empathy. You've got to be willing to sit there and recognize that oftentimes the root of the actual argument runs much deeper than the argument that you're getting so worked up and you're so frustrated about. See, there's power in empathy. There's power in taking a moment to just pause and sit there and say, you know, okay, is this really the situation here, or is there more to the story? You got to dig below the surface. You know, Jesus was the ultimate example of that. When he was on the cross, he was taking our sin, and people were ridiculing him. People were mocking him. People were accusing him. What does Jesus do? At the height of his pain, he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He was able to show compassion because he was able to look and see people through the lens of empathy. He understood